Today's youth need teachers, volunteers, and most of all, well, they need you. I'm Doug Edwards, and I'm going to be talking with real youth mentors and students to give you the knowledge you need to be the best youth worker possible. This is Youth Worker on Fire.
Oh, you're trying to bring me down and run me out of town. You're taking what you want, but you can't take my rhythm now. I'm walking to my own beat, just gonna be me. I'm not replicating nobody. You wanna be like me.
It's late at night here. It's probably morning when you're listening to this. And I thought, I don't think I want to let another day to go by before I record this particular thing that I want to tell you and that I learned a few weeks ago. I've melded over it in my mind and listened several times. But let's start you off with a scripture, and we'll end with one too. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be terrified or dismayed or intimidated, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. It's Joshua 1:9, Amplified Bible. I like the Amplified. I used it because of that word intimidated. It re-emphasized, okay, what's all this terrified and dismayed about? We don't want you to be intimidated. That's what God's saying. If I'm in charge, I'm your God, why are you intimidated? Why are you so afraid? There's nobody bigger than me. There's nothing bigger than me. I've been listening to a few people, and I don't really listen to things like this easily, but some things catch my eye, and I saw the creator of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, and his speech to Princeton, a graduation at Princeton. And Jeff's wife went to Princeton, and that may have been the connection to him speaking for their graduation commencement ceremony. And so a lot of this I wrote down, and I don't like to just read what I wrote down a lot of times because it comes off a little plastic, a little less sincere, but I want to make sure I don't miss too many of the words and processes. Jeff's grandfather, when he was a little kid, said to him one time after he made his grandmother cry, and you have to understand this, this was not intentional at all. Jeff absolutely loved road trips with his grandparents. He talks about that in his speech to Princeton. He was a statistics sort of a guy, even as a kid. So he came up with some stats on something and told his grandmother, thinking that she would think he was very clever. Instead, he made her cry, and she just boo-hooed, just cried. And his grandfather pulled the car over, asked him to come out of the car, and he gently talked to him, didn't say anything about why his grandmother was crying. But he said this to Jeff, and I thought this was very profound. He says, you can choose to be clever, or you can choose to be kind. He said, of course, I didn't know what in the world to do with my grandmother crying and how to respond to that. I didn't expect that reaction at all. And neither did he expect the words that would come to him from his grandfather that were so wise and would last him a lifetime. And later in the speech, he says this. This is really what got to me. You can choose a life of ease and comfort, or you can choose a life of service and adventure. When you are 80, which one of these things will you be more proud of? You're going to be more proud of that choice of service and adventure. People thought he was crazy. He said, I'm going to make billions of dollars, and people tried to discourage him. At the same time, he knew that most businesses didn't last more than 5 years. And so he asked his wife at that time, his young wife, if knowing that if she was willing to go on this adventure with him. And she said yes. But he says to you, and he said to those graduates at Princeton, will you choose a life of service and adventure? When it's tough, will you give up, or will you be relentless? Will you be a cynic, or will you be a builder, he said. Amazon was started at his garage by selling books over the internet. He didn't expect it to last because most businesses don't last. Jeff said in one interview, if you're going to bet on something, always bet on the future. The future always wins. I love this comment from him because also one of the greatest pastors of all time, Rick Warren at Saddleback Church, said something very similar about these things. And the reason that he said this about betting, Bezos said, we've bet on a lot of things. He said, I never bet the entire company on different things that we try. He said the things we have succeeded at are Prime, and he listed several other things that he did, Kindle, throughout the Amazon company. But he said, we spent billions of dollars on bad ideas. He said, billions. He said, but then we would find one or two ideas that would work. And that's what people remember us for. He said, because you can have 10 or 12 bad ideas as long as you end up with one that makes up for all of the bad ones, one good idea. Rick Warren said much the same thing about church, the same thing about student ministry, I say to you. I was out there seeing Doug Fields, who was one of the greatest known youth pastors, especially to high school students in the country. And that's who I was there to be in a conference with and see. And on TED Talk, Rick Warren has 2 TED Talks. And one of the ones he said this, he said, church should be a place, should be a laboratory. You should be able to have the freedom to try things and find out what works for you and your church and your community and what doesn't, without feeling like you're going to lose your ministry, lose your job. And a guy by the name of Dr. John Maxwell says that's called currency, change in your pocket. When you've won so many times that people have learned to trust you, that if you fail 1 or 2 times or here and there, that you have enough change in your pocket from all the good that you've done for them. They say, you know what? He usually wins. This was not his best idea, or this was not the church's best idea, or this is not this career guy's best idea, or this guy who's had this calling. But you know what? We trust them because they still have big wins when they win. And Rick Warren was saying, we have failed more times at Saddleback than we have won. But when we win, we write a book about it and tell the world, and it looks like that's all we do is win. Well, Jeff Bezos is saying the same thing. You've got to experiment. You've got to try. You've got to bet on certain things. We say, well, we're not about betting. We shouldn't be betting, This is church. And catch the spirit of what we're saying here. Not trying to consider it a gambling, but all of life is a gamble. Starting a church is a gamble. Churches are closing across the world. But the churches who have a calling are the churches that last. Businesses that have a calling are the businesses that last. What I found when I would go on my sabbaticals, and I've had several, and I'd go to different churches and to look at their student ministry and their college ministry and things like that, but I would get to see the church as a whole. And some of the greatest churches in our country were churches that were led by one man's calling. And because he took a bet that he could trust God, that what he had put inside of him was what God wanted and that he was going to bless him. Jeff Bezos did the same thing with Amazon. I think it's worth something like $195 billion. It's crazy numbers. They said that when he started, those numbers didn't even exist. Even the national debt was not that big. And this is what the company's worth now. One of the clues God gave me to leaving a ministry position, because sometimes you have to give up to grow up and to go up, was after almost 30 years was when I was told Where else can you make this kind of money at our age? And immediately it hit me. If I'm holding on to a ministry or career because of the money, then you are no longer in a calling. You're in a survival mode. You're in a job. You're in a career which is endable. Later, I was in my last church board meeting, and I heard God say to me in my spirit, "It's over." That was it. It's over. And I resigned that day. It was the right thing to do, and yet the calling hasn't changed. But the scars and the wounds of those last few years of ministry have never completely healed. And the road since at times has almost been crushing for my wife and I. And still, leaving the position was the best decision and the only decision to be made. There's times you do walk away. But I found the guys that have started their church because it was a calling of God on their life. They keep surviving and keep going on. Rick Warren stepped down as the senior pastor and now as the founding pastor simply because he had a physical condition that God wasn't healing that didn't allow him to speak 6 times on Sunday anymore. But he's still doing a worldwide ministry other than Saddleback Church. When you have a calling by God to do certain things or achievement or missions, nothing else will satisfy. I am convinced and confident of this, it says in Philippians 1:6, that he who has begun a good work in you will continue to perfect and complete it until the day of Christ Jesus, the time of his return.
You've been listening to the Youth Worker on Fire podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and tell your friends. Also, leave a comment and tell us what you think. Stay tuned for more informative episodes.